Coinciding with the all-important presidential contest, there's going to be a number of key Senate races which will ultimately determine how much the next president of the United States will be able to get through Congress, at least through the upper chamber, whether that be Joe Biden, another Democrat, or a Republican. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at where these states are likely to land, whether Republican or Democrat, very prematurely over a year and a half out. So this is really based on partisan lean and where I think these states are ultimately going to vote in the presidential election. So as always, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So we'll start off with the state of Nevada and work our way east. Now, Nevada really is a very swingy state. In 2022, it voted for Catherine Cortez Masto by 0.8%, but also elected a Republican governor who, by the way, defeated the Democratic incumbent by 1.5 points. So this is a state that very likely could split ticket, and you very well could see a situation in which a Democrat wins the Senate race narrowly. In this case, Jackie Rosen, who won her first election by 5 points against incumbent Republican Dean Heller, while also seeing a Republican carry Nevada very narrowly federally. Now, I'm not saying this is the most likely scenario, but it's very well possible given Nevada's very split ticket nature as of late, and just the sheer closeness of the state in general. Every state in the country has some degree of split ticket voting. You're never going to have 100% of Republicans or Democrats or even independents vote for the same party throughout their entire ballot, and as such, you're going to see somewhat of a drop-off or maybe a pickup in some of these down-ballot races, of course, depending on who the candidates are. So, of course, if I had to bet money today, based on the way the presidential race is trending, Joe Biden is currently leading the most likely nominee for the Republican Party, Donald Trump, in a number of key battleground states, including Nevada, Jackie Rosen being an incumbent. So far, we don't really know much about a Republican challenger, but I think it's safe to say, as of right now, this is a lean Democratic race. Moving on down to the state of Arizona. Like Nevada, Arizona is a split ticket state. We famously saw this in 2018, where Kyrsten Sinema beat Martha McSally, the Republican, by 2.4%. And yet you had the Republican governor reelected by essentially a landslide margin, and a number of other statewide races also going to the Republicans. So this is a state that elects Republicans and Democrats simultaneously, depending on the office and, of course, depending on the candidate. We saw this again in 2022, Mark Kelly beating Blake Masters by 5 points, while also some down-ballot Republicans actually managed to flip a number of statewide offices or hold them. Of course, the treasurer of Arizona won re-election by a massive margin, almost 12 percentage points, and, performed well all across the state in rural areas, urban areas. Of course, all important Maricopa County, which houses over 60% of the state's population, won by 11 points. So it's really easy to see how this Republican was able to win. But you also had Republicans win closer races. You had the Republicans flip the superintendent of public instruction by 0.3%, which is really incredible. While you also had, of course, Kari Lake, the Republican nominee for governor, the Republican nominee for attorney general, and the Republican nominee for secretary of state all lose while you had Republicans win. So this is very much a split ticket state. Now, with Donald Trump being the likely nominee for the Republican Party at this point in time, and again, I stress at this point in time because it's currently May of 2023, he's crushing it in the Republican primary polls. That very likely could change, but of course, if this does hold, he will be the Republican nominee against Joe Biden or perhaps some other Democrat. I think it's very likely that Arizona stays blue. I think Ruben Gallego, the likely Democratic nominee, would probably beat any of the Republicans going up against him at this point in time. Currently, apparently today, although I'm not around, I won't be around for the next couple of days, so these videos are going to be pre-recorded, but apparently it is rumored that Kari Lake may potentially announce a bid for Senate, and if that's the case and she's the nominee, she's very likely going to lose that race to Ruben Gallego by a couple of points. Moving on up to Montana. Now, this is a state that really shouldn't be competitive for Democrats. I mean, it's a state that Donald Trump won by over 16 points back in the 2020 election. And, going back several cycles, Montana's been a reliably Republican state. And yet John Tester, the incumbent senator there, has continually won re-election by pretty narrow margins, all in good years for the Democrats. We saw this in 2016. He beat a Republican incumbent very narrowly. Of course, in 2012, he beat a Republican by, I believe, about 4 points. And then, of course, in 2018, he beats his Republican opponent by around 3.5 points. So this is a very, very contested race, even though it's a red state federally. Jon Tester is very popular in the state of Montana, and it's going to really take a lot less split ticket voting, a lot more Trump voters also voting for the Republican nominee for Senate. So it's very crucial that Republicans don't mess up this nominating process. They nominate somebody who has broad appeal in the state and can actually win over some of these Trump tester voters that could potentially make up the electorate, because there are definitely going to be Trump tester voters in this scenario. So, given the partisan makeup of Montana and given the way I think Montana is likely to vote in the presidential election, I assume Montana's probably going to go about R plus 14, R plus 15 potentially at this point in time. On the low end, I'd say R plus 12, but even that, I think it's very likely that Republicans in that scenario would be able to flip this seat narrowly. Now, again, I stress the importance on the Republican nominee because I think that makes all the difference, but in a generic Republican versus Jon Tester battle for the Senate seat, I think Republicans would come out on top in a presidential environment. Moving down to New Mexico, this isn't really too contested, although I don't think it's going to necessarily be a 12-point margin. You have incumbent Senator Martin Heinrich, who in his last election won by a whopping 24 percentage points, almost 24 percentage points, only really because you had Libertarian Gary Johnson taking away a sizable amount of the Republican vote. So, this isn't always a cut and dry thing, but if you add up all the votes Gary Johnson had to the Republican nominees, you get to a place where the Republicans have about 45, almost 46% of the vote, which would make this around a D plus 10 race. So while this race could potentially be safe, I think it's going to vote very much in line with the state. I think it's going to be about D plus 11, almost on the cusp of D plus 12, what I consider safe as of this current moment. Moving on over to Texas, Ted Cruz has been noted as a very vulnerable Republican incumbent, mainly because he's not very popular in Texas, at least compared to where he should be in a state like this. Now, Texas has been trending left for the past, really ever since 2004 federally. If you really want to zero in, it's really happened rapidly after the 2016 election. Of course, in 2016, Donald Trump only won the state of Texas by 9 percentage points. That's a very small margin when you compare the fact that Romney won the state of Texas by 15, McCain won it by 13, and of course George W. Bush won it by over 20 back in 2004. So you've seen a continual trend towards the left. Mitt Romney sort of bucked that trend a little bit, but by and large, since 2004, Texas has been trending back towards the Democrats. Now, currently, I think Ted Cruz is favored. His Democratic likely opponent, Colin Allred, I don't think is the strongest candidate. I think he's the candidate that Democrats are going with. I think he can raise probably a lot of money. But I think at the end of the day, this race still fundamentally favors Republicans. So I think as of right now, this is going to be lean Republican. It's not impossible for the state of Texas to flip. I think in order for that to happen, it would probably have to flip federally. I think if Trump's the nominee, oddly enough, I think Ted Cruz would actually outperform Trump in some of the suburban counties very slightly, maybe giving him a 1 to 2 percentage point increased margin over Trump. So given that, I think he's going to win re-election in 2024. Moving on up to the state of Wisconsin, Democrats have current incumbent Tammy Baldwin. She won by around 10 points back in 2018. Again, this was a blue wave year on the same ballot that Scott Walker almost won re-election, only lost by 1.1%, really highlighting the split ticket nature in some of these Rust Belt states like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania, as we're going to talk about a little later. I think this race fundamentally favors Democrats. I think Tammy Baldwin would likely outrun the top of the ticket, even if it is Donald Trump. If Donald Trump somehow won Wisconsin, I still think Tammy Baldwin would probably win re-election. So given the fact that I think Wisconsin leans in Biden's column as of right now in the presidential election, I think this seat is going to remain in Democratic control by a lean margin. Moving on over to Michigan, this is a state that Republicans haven't had a lot of success in really since 2016. Again, back in 2016, Donald Trump was the first Republican nominee to win the state of Michigan since 1988, winning it by only 0.3% and only getting 47.3% of the vote. So this was a pretty massive feat in and of itself. In 2020, he lost the state of Michigan by 2.8%. And interestingly enough, the Republican nominee for Senate actually outperformed him. John James got 48.2% of the vote. Gary Peters got just under 50%. So this was a much closer margin than the Democrats would have liked. It's very possible that we see a similar sort of reaction in the 2020 election, especially given the fact that Republicans down ballot in Michigan seem to do a lot better in some of these suburban counties where Trump does very poorly. I mean, John James won Kent County, home to Grand Rapids, a pretty populous county, ancestrally Republican county in western Michigan. Of course, on the top of the ticket, though, Donald Trump lost Kent County by a pretty considerable margin. He lost it by about 6 points. So there's a decent down ballot swing. I think it's very likely that the Democrat nominee for president carries Michigan. And I think even though the Republican could potentially outperform that nominee, especially given the fact that this is an open race, I still think this seat leans towards the Democrats. I've originally had this as likely blue. I've now categorized this as lean blue. I think Republicans might do slightly better here. Alyssa Slotkin isn't exactly the strongest Democratic nominee, but I still think she'll get the job done as of right now. Moving on down to Ohio, this is another Trump state that really should be an easy win for Republicans, but it has a Democratic incumbent, Sherrod Brown, who is sort of marketed as this working class populist Democrat who, while he votes with the Democratic Party virtually 100% of the time, he does sort of have an appeal to some Republican and even Trump voters in rural Ohio. And that's really illustrated by the margins he got in rural Ohio. You just compare some of these margins in southeastern and just eastern Ohio in general, northeastern Ohio, to the margins that Donald Trump would get just 2 years later. A massive difference, a massive shift towards the left between 2020 and 2018. And Sherrod Brown is certainly going to outrun whoever the Democratic nominee for president is. Now, that being said, I still think this race fundamentally leans in the Republicans' direction. And, you know, one of the reasons I say that is because back in 2022, a fairly good candidate on the Democratic side, Tim Ryan, lost to J.D. Vance, a candidate who really didn't campaign that much, by a 6-point margin. So I really cite this as part of the reason why I think Ohio could fundamentally lean more in Republicans' direction in this case. Sherrod Brown is an incredibly strong incumbent, though, so because of that, we're going to put this in the tilt Republican category, and I think this could very well change depending on how the top of the ticket does in Ohio. If the Republican is only winning by 5 points on the presidential level, Sherrod Brown probably wins re-election. So I think the safe number for Republicans is a margin of victory anywhere from 6 to 8, preferably 8 for the GOP, similar to the 2016 and 2020 margins that Donald Trump got in the state, which could hopefully be enough for them to flip this seat. Moving on over to Pennsylvania, Bob Casey Jr. is an incredibly strong incumbent. He beat Rick Santorum by about 17 points back in 2006, won re-election by 9 points in 2012, and then, of course, in the 2018 midterms, beat Trump acolyte Lou Barletta by 13 percentage points. This is very much going to be a race heavily slanted towards the Democrats. Now, I do think in a federal year, Bob Casey does not outperform as much as he does in midterm years. In 2012, for instance, Bob Casey only won the state of Pennsylvania by 9. Obama won the state of Pennsylvania by about 5 to 6. So he overperformed by about 4 points. That's still, I think, it gives him an easy path to re-election. I think at this point in time, Bob Casey would probably win re-election by around 10, 11 points. Again, depending on the nominee for Senate and, of course, the nominee at the top of the ticket, you could argue that a strong Republican would drag down this margin a bit, but I think Bob Casey is going to be incredibly, incredibly hard to beat. And I think Republicans' efforts are really on states like Wisconsin, states like Nevada, Arizona, obviously flipping Ohio, Montana, and we'll get to West Virginia in just a minute. But even places like Michigan, potentially, before they even go to Pennsylvania, just because Bob Casey is a very strong incumbent. Moving on down to West Virginia, Joe Manchin has not announced his intent to run for re-election, but Jim Justice, the Republican governor, very, very popular, widely believed to be heavily favored in this race, is running. I think if it's Jim Justice versus Manchin, I think Justice wins by at least 20 points, which would certainly put this in the safe category. The only reason I wanted to put West Virginia in the toss-up category originally was so we could discuss it more, because I don't really think this is going to be a lean or likely race. I don't even think West Virginia Senate is going to be remotely close. really regardless of who the nominee is, unless it's a really bad Republican nominee. But other than that, I think any Republican would have a very easy time winning this seat. Obviously, if it's an open seat, Republicans are basically guaranteed it, and if Manchin is running, they'll probably win it by a lower safe margin, but it will still be a pretty comfortable margin of victory. Moving on down to Virginia, assuming Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, I think this would be a safe hold for the Democratic Party. I think if there was another Republican at the top of the ticket and a good nominee for Senate, I think Virginia could get a decent amount more competitive, but I don't really think it's realistic to say at this point in time that Virginia Senate would actually flip towards Republicans. It would take really crazy circumstances nationally for that to happen, and I don't think we're going to see that in 2024. Finally, down to the state of Florida, Rick Scott, who flipped this seat incredibly narrowly against Democratic incumbent Bill Nelson, is running for re-election. I think he's heavily favored given the fact that Florida has moved pretty considerably to the right since 2016. Again, Republicans massively outperformed in 2018. Donald Trump won the state by over 3 points in 2020. And then in 2022, there was a massive red wave in Florida. I think that's likely to continue. I think if I had to guess, Rick Scott would probably win Florida Senate by a likely margin. I think he's going to underperform the top of the ticket slightly. He tends to be an underperformer. He underperformed Ron DeSantis. But nonetheless, I think he's still going to be able to hold on to this seat. And with these projections, this would give the Republicans a 52-48 majority in the U.S. Senate as of right now. Again, a lot can change from now until 2024, but I think as of now, this is probably the safe prediction and the one that the trends and dynamics of the race back up. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.